taught in the Milwaukee Jewish Day School. She taught junior high school English, and I can't think of a more difficult thing on the planet to do than that. Marilyn now lives in Minneapolis, where my other siblings live, with her husband and 3 kids and 7 grandchildren. She's the only one of us with grandchildren so far, which makes the rest of us jealous, but we're happy for her. And we love them all. And next in line is Sherry Cooper. There's my sister, Sherry. And Sherry lives in Minneapolis also. Married to Bill, has 2 boys, one married, one not. And Sherry, for most of her professional career, ran a medical lab for, I think it was a healthcare company, right, Sherry? Not actually any specific hospital or anything, but also an amazing person, probably the best of all of us at school, I would say. At least you got into the least trouble, I think. Yeah, it's a low bar. Then we have Joanne Gruen. Joanne is in Palm Springs right now, but also lives in Minneapolis. Joanne, for a while, was in HR with a very big company in Minnesota, and is now learning to paint. And Joanne is married to Bruce, and they have 2 kids, one of whom is married, one of whom is not. No grandchildren yet, but we're hopeful. And then we have my brother, Greg, who the older we get, the more people think we're identical twins. And it's hard to disagree just looking at this Zoom. How the world could be so blessed with 2 of us, Greg, I just don't know.
I don't either.
Anyway, so Greg lives in Minneapolis, but also has a home in Palm Springs, where he is now. And he and his husband, Tom, have a son, Elliot, who is the tallest and most handsome of all in the Leder family. And Greg is an IT guy. He oversees massive IT operations for some enormous companies. And he's good looking too. So there you have it. This is the 5 of us, and all 5 of us took this journey that is chronicled. The book chronicles the journey with our father, parallel to being a kind of field guide to help people through facing all of the issues that come with the end of life, and with grief and mourning, and with loss in general, not just loss of life. But no one knows the story better than the 5 of us on this Zoom tonight. That is the foundation of this book. So I'm very, very grateful to my sisters and my brother for being with me tonight to do this. It's not an easy thing for any of us to do. And I deeply appreciate it, and deeply love and appreciate each of them. And let's begin, Susan.
So we're going to start to talk a little bit about the book. I actually read the book twice, and I read it each time in one sitting. This is not a long book, but it's a very deep book. And I suspect that people will read it once, and then when the time arises, when they'll have a need, they'll have questions, they're going to go back to this book. So let's just talk a little bit about why you wrote this book. And I want to also address, in the introduction, you say this book is an apology. So tell us about the book, and what is the apology about?
Well, I think everyone watching knows I was a rabbi for 30 years before our dad died. And in those 30 years, obviously, it helped more than 1,000 families through the experience of death and losing a loved one, and mourning and grief, among all the other kinds of loss that, rabbis help people with. There are many kinds of loss. I think we're all understanding that now in this pandemic. Losing your sense of invulnerability, losing your freedom to move around as you please. You can lose your reputation. You can lose your money. You can lose your breasts. You can lose your marriage. There are many types of loss, and I wanted, and for 30 years I was helping people through that loss, and then our father died, and I realized that, as I say in the introduction in the book, much of what I had been saying to people, and I would have given myself a pretty decent grade before my dad died. I would have given myself maybe an A- in terms of helping people. But I realized through the process of losing dad and him dying that some of what I'd been telling people was just 1 degree shy of the absolute deepest truth. And I wanted in the book to correct that. I wanted to bring people that 1 degree deeper toward the truth that is death and loss and moving on. And that's the apology part, is this is where I got it wrong. This is what was wrong about it. And this is what I really believe is the deepest truth now. There are things I used to say to people I don't say any longer. There are things I used to say that have changed. There are things I never used to say that now I do. Because observing something and living it are not the same thing. And I had spent 30 years observing death, but I'd never lived it the way we lived it with our father. So that's the apology part. And I wrote it for that reason. And I wrote it to put the reader on my shoulder and allow each reader to see what it's like to navigate through death and therefore through life. What are the ways in which death makes our lives more meaningful, more beautiful, more purposeful, less foolish? And so those are all the reasons that I wrote the book. And that's the apology part, is trying to set the record straight on some very fundamental things that I think I got wrong.
So I analyzed your book, and I realized it was broken into several sections with, tangents here and there. The first being an understanding of death, then the experience of a loved one, when someone is dying. There's the idea of someone dying, and then there's the actual experience of the death itself, and then the grief process, and then the afterlife or the aftermath of the person's death, memory, and the beauty, as you call it, of what remains. So I want to go in order kind of the book in terms of talking to everyone. And I want us now turn to your siblings and ask you, and I'll call on each one of you. But my first question is, your father got, first of all, Wilshire Boulevard Temple is a little different than the other audiences because we've kind of lived a lot of this with Steve. We've heard about your dad. We knew that he was suffering from Alzheimer's for many years. We saw Steve travel back and forth to Minneapolis and give us updates. And so when you get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, that is a death sentence. We knew your dad, and you knew your dad was dying. So my first question to you is, what was your attitude about death in the beginning of your dad's illness? And did it change as he approached the end, as he deteriorated and got sicker and sicker? And so I'm going to start with Marilyn. How did you feel about it when in the beginning and then almost 10 years later when he died?
At the beginning, it was profoundly sad. And I didn't live in Minneapolis at the time. So in a weird kind of way, because he couldn't communicate, you couldn't talk to him. It was though he were already in a way dead. And then I would come to Minneapolis every 4 or 5 weeks, drive in, and then the sadness kind of hit again. To see him that way, I always felt he wouldn't choose to live like this. It was terrible. Through the course of things, there were times when I took comfort in the fact that probably he didn't understand what was happening, and that was a comfort to me. But then every once in a while, something would happen, like he'd speak, and it was like, oh my gosh, he really does. He does know, and that's very hard.
Very hard.
I kind of wished he were oblivious to it. And by the end of the process, I think I would say that I came to kind of terms with the idea that you play the cards you're dealt, you do the best you can with what you got to work with. And he really did, and our family really did. And that was a comfort.
Thank you. Sherry, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, well, you know, living here and kind of my role within the family has been sort of the medical part of things. You know, through the entire process, you know, I worked really hard at the kind of the medical, the technical, the get the doctors, figure out what's wrong, figure out, you know, how do you deal with this, or how do you deal with infections, or all of that kind of stuff. And so it really kind of took the emotion out of it for me a lot of the time. And his decline was, you know, stages of different things happening, and you know, something new would happen that needed to be figured out. And that's kind of where, you know, I would feel like I would like jump in and, you know, we can't get him to swallow. How are we going to get calories in him? You know, he loves ice cream. We're just going to feed him ice cream, you know. So it was really, you know, I was really kind of working the technical part of things, not as much the emotional, although of course I was experiencing it. So I kind of, in the end, for me, you know, it wasn't a shock. It kind of just was. It just was.
Just was.
Yeah.
Greg, so at one point when your dad had a medical emergency, you said to Steve, I wish he would die, when he was really sick. And Steve writes about this and says, I was shocked in the beginning, and then I realized that he was right. Can you talk a little bit about that feeling, Greg?
Yeah, I think at the beginning, when we first realized that he could not be at home anymore, and that this was sort of the beginning of the end, we didn't know how long it would take. But there was an incident, I think, where Joanne and we were with Dad at the Shalom home, and when he first got there, I know you'll remember this, and he was upset, and he couldn't verbalize what he was worried or upset about. And it was so disturbing. And we kept throwing things out there like, are you worried about Mom? Are you worried about money? Are you worried about your brother? Yeah. And then we kind of finally made it. Well, that was awful when you would see him in that state, versus later when he was more just kind of there, but often just distant and seemed more at peace in a way. But the length of it went on for so long, and his world became so small. And that just wasn't my dad at all. You know, my dad was big personality and potent. And so by the end, you knew that he was just, because he was so tough, he was just holding on. Like he didn't know how not to just be tough and hold on. And so it would have been just such a blessing for him to be at peace and to let go. And so, you know, I think it was a few years before he actually died. He had pneumonia or something, and, you know, everybody rushed in with antibiotics, with everything, because there was a seed, an element of some kind of life still there. So you kind of had to. We weren't ready. He wasn't ready. But boy, it would have been nice to spare him those extra few years of just suffering. I don't know.
Joanne, did you feel similarly, or did you have a different experience?
I was scared. You know, my father, I was very close to him, and I was really scared And so when he would get sick, I would freak. And he got sick over and over and over and over. And the hardest part I felt was just not knowing where we were on the journey. Where are we? And every time he would get sick, he would be a bit more diminished. He wouldn't recover to the place that he had been. But I always figured, and you might laugh, everybody, but I always figured when Dad stopped eating, we would know he didn't want to live anymore. Because my father loved to eat, okay?
Yeah.
And he kept eating, and it was like the hard part for me was letting him go. So,
So Steve, we know that you would fly in and see the decline. You would report to us that, your dad was getting sicker and sicker and could barely speak, and you shared different experiences. But I want to start with you on this next question is, when he actually died, was it different than watching his decline? When the finality of death, was that different and was it surprising?
Yeah. No, it's very different, even if you know it's coming. It was the thing that was always just around the corner, but never arrived. But then it did. And I remember exactly where I was when the call came. I was at a birthday party for someone. We were in her backyard. Betsy was with me. And the phone rang, and it was Minneapolis, and it was pretty late for Minneapolis time. And Joanne was on the phone, and she said, "Steve, can you talk?" I said, "Just give me a minute. I found a quiet place." And then she put my mom on the phone. And my mother, very matter-of-factly, and we may or may not get into her tonight, but my mother matter-of-factly said, "Stephen, your father died." That was it. And it immediately catapulted me into that surreal fog of death, which is another one of those things, Susan, that I had witnessed in others, but never really understood. I never really understood the surreal nature and how you're not really part of the world when you get that news and you go through the process. You're sort of there, but sort of not. I think it's partly shock and sadness, and it's partly our psyches protecting ourselves, but and I've seen this so many times as a rabbi. I've had people with, a 98-year-old parent who can't believe she died. And I used to think to myself, who can't believe a 98-year-old is going to die? But now I understand it. I do understand why you never think it's going to happen, even though you know it's going to happen. And it was the fog of death, which I now understand in a way I did not before. So yes, it was different.
Greg, you had talked about wanting him to be relieved of this suffering. When he finally died, how did it affect you?
Well, I was glad I got the call from my sister Marilyn, and I happened to live 2 blocks away from the nursing home. So I just threw on my clothes and I went right over there. And so I was alone with him in the room for maybe 20 minutes or so. But I don't remember how long it was. But the interesting thing for me is that it was immediate for me that it was no longer my father. It was just this body.
Right.
And it didn't mean the same thing as Dad. That body didn't. So it kind of gave me that piece, like, oh my God, I kind of get it, that the soul is somewhere else. It's not this body. Because the minute he was gone, even though the body, my dad, was laying there right in front of me. It was very kind of a strange experience. And frankly, I felt like I was ready for it, in the sense that, in one way, it's a luxury to have 8, 9, 10 years to get prepared, to say goodbye, to all those kinds of things. Everything was said, everything was done. and it made me realize how much, I don't know, harder, but different it would be if you suddenly lost somebody that was so big and important in your life and you didn't have that same. So in that way, I felt kind of lucky.
So Marilyn, you're nodding your head. And you're the one who made the call to Greg. So
I always feel like when you hear that someone has died suddenly, I always think, I hope that's how I go. But it makes it incredibly more difficult for those who are left behind. And with my dad, he didn't suffer. It wasn't as though hospice called us and said, he has a matter of hours, you should come. He was just gone in his sleep. And it just was, as Sherry said. So, and I also was, all five of us and our mom, we were in the room. He was in the bed, but he was gone. I felt that too. His soul was gone.
Sherry, so you were the medical person, the caregiver. What was there a void, or what was your reaction with the finality of your dad's passing?
I mean, I always knew it was inevitable. And like I said before, it was easier for me to sort of pull the emotions back. But hearing it still took my breath away, and made me go, like jump to right away. Okay, I'm coming, because I was really used to that happening. Your dad's got a fever. Okay, I'll be there in 5 minutes. That same sort of adrenaline, kicked in. But the phone call from Marilyn, it was still a shock. It was still really hard to hear.
Susan, I've so often said that people face death the same way they face life. And you're seeing that tonight, that each of us with our unique personalities and ways of helping and ways of avoiding and all our mishigas, we were the same way in his death as we were in his life, just more so, just more intense.
Yes, so I kept Joanne for last on purpose, because you had all this fear. And once your worst fear happened, what were your feelings?
I was afraid to walk in the nursing home room. That was really, I didn't know how I was going to be able to do it and see him dead. But once I did it and I looked at him, I think Greg said everything that I would say. I felt relief. I felt like, oh, wow, he's not suffering anymore. And I felt relief from that.
So Steve talked about how you're all more so, each of your responses to the death, but what about toward each other? How did your relationship change or evolve during your dad's illness and after his death? So Steve, I'm going to start with you.
I think for me, I can just speak for myself. I think that, well, let me put it this way. When we were kids, we had a job wheel. We were 5 kids with 2 completely clueless parents when it came to raising children, and they knew they needed systems put in place. And so one of the things we had was a job wheel, and every Sunday we'd have a family meeting. Marilyn was the secretary, and we would have a family meeting every Sunday, and part of the agenda was we would spin the job wheel and we would have our job for the week. And I think it was ingrained in us very early that when there's something to be done or a crisis, you get to work, you do your job. And that's how we approached this. We each did our jobs as best we could. I was very limited in some ways for obvious reasons. I was 2,000 miles away. But I felt my job when I was with my dad was to have very candid conversations with him. Sometimes they were one-way conversations because he couldn't really respond. But I did try to be the son and the rabbi to some degree with my dad. And we each did our thing. And I feel, and look, we don't talk every day. We're not one of those families where we're, in each other's business all the time. That being said, I feel closer to each one of my siblings as a result of what we've been through with Dad, and as a result of the grief and mourning process, and honestly, as a result of this book, because there's, I was sensitive not to make them spectacles in the book, but it's their story too. It's not just my story. And I'm grateful, so grateful that each of my siblings was there and there to help. And I'll say this, the other thing, and I think you guys will agree with me. We really can't talk much to our mother about our dad because I won't say she doesn't care, but she has a lot of complicated feelings about our dad and their marriage. And we don't have complicated feelings. Well, maybe, but they're very different in terms of how complicated they are. I don't think they're nearly like her feelings. Mm-hmm. And so really it's the five of us. It's not something we share, or I certainly don't share much with Mom, because she doesn't want to talk about Dad very much, if at all. And so when I really want to reminisce and talk about Dad, these are the four people in the whole world that I can really do it with. Whether we're texting or whether we're talking, it doesn't matter where or what. These are the people in the world who understand. And to me, that's a very intimate and close thing that we share. It's our dad bringing us together yet again.
So what about the rest of you in terms of your relationships to each other? Did they strengthen? Did they change? Did they evolve? I'm curious to hear. Sherry?
In some ways, I don't think there's a big difference. But in other ways, I think there is. And when I think about it, I think about, okay, the way that we rallied around my dad, I think we have a little more understanding of things when we now need to rally around my mother. Mm-hmm. And, we are tight about doing that. And, having done it with my dad, makes us understand more, I think, about what to expect with my mom and what's going to happen and her needs and, that whole process. The other thing for me is what Stephen said about being able to reminisce. And there's nothing better than when somebody starts a text maybe with a comment about Dad, and then it just rolls. And everybody has a comment and we all have funny things to say, and it makes me laugh and it makes me feel close to everybody when that happens.
And you know what, without being too heavy-handed about the whole thing, that's the beauty that remains. That's what it is. We can text a single word to each other and it's a universe of memories and stories with just a single word. And that's, to me, really beautiful.
Yeah. So I want to tack on to this question as I go forward, which is about, did you depend on each other in your grieving process? And Steve talks a lot about the grieving process. And you had a unique, I'd say, dilemma, because your dad died on the day of Erev Yom Kippur. And so there was no Shiva, which in Judaism is really helpful to have that Shiva. But anyway, anyone who's had Shiva knows that the 7 days is just a drop in the bucket in terms of grief and mourning. So I'm curious about your, how did you grieve? How did you deal with it? And did it include the relationship with your siblings? Did that help, or was that incorporated in your grief or your grief process? So Greg?
Mine was a little unique because we lost my father-in-law, and then 2 weeks later is when we lost my dad. And it was the first parent for both of us, for me and for Tom. So we sort of had parallel grieving that was, that was very unique and helpful in a way. So I don't think I really relied very much on my siblings per se for the grieving.
How did you grieve? How did you grieve?
How did I grieve? I'm pretty tough, like my father, and
He didn't.
I get to work and work.
Yeah, work helps. It does help.
Work helps. Again, it did help to have my spouse going through it at the same time, that we could, kind of talk about how the thing I didn't realize is how exhausted I would be, and how exhausting the grief, the cycles of grief. I've had a lot of anxiety in my life, and during the day, if you're anxious, you go through these little anxiety attacks. By the end of the day, you're dead, tired. It was like that. It was like those waves of grief just wipe you out.
Yes. Joanne, what about your grief process?
Well, again, I have to agree with Greg. It was exhausting, but I was kind of like, Diana would call it. I was glad I didn't have a long Shiva thing, because by that time I was tired.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be able to deal with it on my own too. And so, I cried a lot. I told Steve, I never really understood why, why the prayers and all that. But, I took a period of time in the morning when I got up to think about it, did a lot of crying, and then moved on. And then something would remind me and I'd cry some more. But
I think that's very normal. I think that is, people need to give themselves the space to be exhausted and to cry and to live with the emotion that they have. Marilyn, what about you?
Well, first of all, just my immediate family, we have 15 people, just my kids and grandchildren, my husband. So all of us are right here. We all live within 15 minutes of each other, and we all helped each other through. My kids were very close with their grandfather. My grandchildren maybe didn't know him when he was well, but they knew him. So we were all together, and that was very helpful. Also, going back to work was helpful to me. And saying Kaddish was helpful to me. I don't know how people do 7 days of sitting Shiva, because one day, one night, and I'm done. It was hard. It was exhausting. The good thing about it was I saw so many people I hadn't seen in ages. My cousin David flew in from Arizona for the day. Cousins, friends, people drove in from St. Paul who, in a rainstorm. People came from Milwaukee to be with us. So that was so comforting. But to have to be on, sitting Shiva for 7 days, hard.
Well, yes, and it's a mitzvah, we know, to comfort the mourner, and holding each other up in these times is part of surviving the grief process. Steve, you wrote about you had to come back right after the funeral and be our rabbi again, and be the rabbi and do other people's funerals. And though you weren't here for Yom Kippur, you had to plunge right back into this life. And you wrote about some ways that you found to handle grief that you wanted to share with your readers. And I'd love you to share them with us now.
Well, first of all, like Marilyn, for me, saying Kaddish every morning saved my life. I never really fully appreciated the power and the the holding capacity, the volume of grief that Kaddish could hold for me. So that was very, very helpful and important to me. We began with this idea of the book being an apology. One of the things that I learned about grief that I really did not understand before, we're all taught, for those of us in the seminaries, we're taught in psychology classes, we're all taught that there are stages to grief. And that implies that grief is a kind of linear process. But it's not. I think there are components to grief, but I don't think there are stages. I don't think that first you feel this, then you feel that, and then you feel the next thing. In the book, I talk about it in much more like waves. And sometimes there's a rogue wave. Sometimes your back is turned and it's pretty calm. And then the next thing you know, you look up and it just crashes down on me. I'll speak for myself. It just crashes down on me. A small thing can just activate so much sorrow in my heart. And, I used to say to people at the cemetery, there are probably a lot of people watching right now that I've said this to. I'd look people in the eyes and I would say, Susan, the most honest and helpful thing I can say to you right now is that it won't always hurt so much. I don't say that anymore. What I say now is, Susan, the most honest and helpful thing I can say to you is it won't always hurt so often. Because the truth is, when it hurts, at least for me, when I'm really missing my dad, it's like he died yesterday.
Right.
And grief is not a linear process or journey. It's not something that gets a little better each day until it clears up, like a cold or a rash. And I think making peace with that, just to extend the wave metaphor a little bit, what helped me is, rather than trying to stand up against this massive wave, which means you're just going to get knocked over and turned upside down and gasping for air, I learned that just like a wave, when the grief comes, it's best to just float with it. Just lie down and float with it. And when you can, stand up again. And that's grief, it's not linear. So that helped me a great deal to just say, okay, you're missing your dad right now. You're incredibly sad. Sit with it. Just sit with it. And sometimes I would text Marilyn or Sherry or Joanne or Greg or all of them and just text them. There's a piece in the book about our texting when I was in Palm Springs walking around and saw the lyrics to You Are My Sunshine on somebody's back porch, which was the song our dad loved to sing to us when we were all in the blue Chevy station wagon on some Sunday driving somewhere he wanted to go for fun. And, so reaching out really helps. I don't think anybody suffers better alone. I think giving into it really helps. I don't think it's a sign of weakness or a lack of progress in grief. I think that is just what we need to do sometimes, is just float with it. And Kaddish. And honestly, writing the book really helped me. It was painful, but also really helpful.
I think it's important to share this because people should know it's normal to continue to grieve, to have waves of grief. They're not supposed to get over it. There's no time limit. I always say you don't move on, you move with. You bring them with you, and you continue.
And there's no wrong way to grieve.
But there are wrong things to say.
Oh, yes.
And you wrote about that in the book. It's like, don't say this to someone who's grieving.
Yeah.
And so I want to ask each of you now, what was the worst thing someone said to you, if you can remember, or the best thing, or one of each, if you can recall? What was the worst thing or best thing, or both? Marilyn.
He's in a better place.
Right.
Yeah.
Terrible, right?
Terrible.
Yeah, because he's not here, right?
He's not better for me. I don't know about you, but it's not better for me. But maybe that's somebody else's faith tradition, that's what they believe. But it was not good.
Sherry?
To be honest, it didn't really matter to me what people said,
Right.
because I was in my own head about it, and it didn't help me any, or it didn't hurt me any, because it was, it was what I was feeling inside me. So I didn't really care.
You didn't care.
Mm-mm.
Joanne?
I really got upset when one of our relatives said, I never went to see Leonard because I didn't want to see him like that. It would hurt me too much.
Mm.
Right, like it was about them.
That did not sit well with me, but.
Thank you. Greg?
I don't really remember anything that stands out as wonderful or terrible that people said, but I do just remember being surprised by people. You can tell when somebody's clued in, and just and the number of people that you get a card from or you hear from, that's what really made a difference. And and as weird as it sounds, I thought the funeral was fun. I mean, to have Stephen was on, he was on. He'd been preparing for this basically his whole life. Steve and I went out in front as everybody was coming in, and we got to see everybody and talk. I mean, it was, my dad would have liked it. I think he would.
Right.
So I don't know. I don't remember anybody saying anything terrible to me, but.
So Steve, what are some of the worst things someone can say, if you remember from your book, or good things, something they should say or could say that would be helpful?
Well, the thing that bothered me was when people were not themselves in expressing their condolences. People would sort of put on this falsely sad persona that wasn't them. Now, the other side of that is what I appreciated so much was when people were themselves. When our cousin Penny was effusive and hugging and joking and laughing, and I didn't need people coming up to me with their somber faces and their kind of bad acting. I wanted them to be who they were, and I would say that to everyone. When you are trying to support people who are grieving, just be who you are. If you're a feeder, feed them. If you're a hugger, hug them. If you're a joker, joke with them. If you're a listener, listen. And the other thing I would say, there are many, but I did not appreciate people trying to distract me from my grief. Oh, Stephen, what's happening in LA? I don't really care what's happening in LA. I want to talk about my dad. Don't distract people who are grieving from the reason they're grieving. Go into it, lean into it. Don't, try to distract them. I think it causes more harm than good. I've said many times, never, ever say to someone, and I know everybody listening tonight has heard me say this, never say, let me know if you need anything. Because first of all, most people don't mean it when they say it. And even if they do mean it, now I've got more homework and I'm already exhausted. If there's anything I can do, let me know. I'm not going to do that. And if you really care, figure it out and do something, So I think that's a part of it. And, I'll tell you the nicest thing I heard, this might surprise my siblings, was actually at our dad's unveiling a year later. And our oldest cousin of our generation, Marshall, was there. And Marshall, who doesn't say much, he's a pretty quiet guy. I don't know if you guys remember this or not, but at the unveiling, we just let everybody who wanted to say something. And Marshall said, everyone's here thinking about Lenny when he got old and when he had Alzheimer's. I'm thinking about the Lenny who, when I was a little boy, took me roller skating and put roller skates on me and took me out on the floor, and we had a good time. And that comforted me, because it was an opportunity, first of all, to hear a part of my dad from before I was even born. but also to remember my dad doing something he loved, and to know that other people had such good memories of him really helped me. So I think it goes again to the idea of really sharing with people in a real way. And authenticity is everything, I think, when you're dealing with people who are so vulnerable. Just be authentic.
So you want people to be authentic, and I won't say but, you wrote that when you actually saw your dad in the casket, you suddenly realized that you had to be more authentic, perhaps in your own life. That well, you have given a sermon on this. A little is a lot, but
Yeah.
you personally realized how important the little things are, or that it was important to make priorities about your life, because it hits you when you lose a parent. Well, this is going to happen to me, or I'm next, or life is finite and I shouldn't waste any more time. So I'd like to ask all of you, what did you come to appreciate more after your dad died? And did you change your life in any way after this loss? I'll start with Joanne.
I appreciate experiences more than things, and having fun and enjoying life. My dad was all about that. And I think I feel more so how important that was. I do want to bring up that in the book, Stephen, you used that example of the marbles in the jar, the guy.
Yes.
And for me, that was really meaningful, that you start to realize how precious your days are when you realize how numbered your days are.
Mm-hmm.
Dad, that whole experience helped me with that.
Greg, what about you?
For me, I think it just helped me just kind of be more present all the time, and or pull myself back into the present. And I don't know, I'm much younger than the rest of these people, so I kind of had to, in a way, it just kind of makes you grow up a little bit, not having, my dad was a force to be reckoned with, and, you knew somebody had your back. My dad had our backs, and, sure, my mom would always try to and will, and our siblings do for each other and stuff, but it was kind of time to just say, you know what, I got my own, it's time, you got to have your own back.
Yeah.
And be that for others. So
yeah,
I think that was kind of it for me.
Marilyn?
The change in my life happened when my dad was sick, when he started getting sick, more so than after he died. But, it's hard to be a caregiver when you're there, but it's also hard in a different way when you can't be there.
Yeah.
And my husband and I quit our jobs and sold our house after 35 years and moved to Minneapolis so we could be with family. I wanted to be there for my dad. I wanted to be there to help my mom. I wanted to be with my siblings, and I wanted to be with my kids. I wanted to be part of my grandchildren's lives. I thought a lot about how my dad was he was great at being a grandfather, and he treasured every minute with every kid. And that's what I want. I didn't want to be an out-of-town guest. I wanted to be a part of their lives. And we moved to make it happen. And I think a big impetus was when he got sick.
Sherry?
I don't know, it's kind of weird, but my dad was the last of his 5 siblings. And we talk a little bit about how we're now the aunts and uncles that we remember when we were young. And it kind of makes me think about, we're next. And who out of the 5 of us is going to die first? And what is that going to be like? How, you know, it just sort of elevated that thought that, you know, we're kind of getting there ourselves. The other thing that I think about after reading the book was, you know, my husband and I were really good about getting a will, you know, and getting things in order maybe 5 years ago, but I never thought about doing an ethical will. And by reading yours, Stephen, it really helped me see the value and why would I want to do that for my kids?
Yeah.
And it has me thinking about that I'm going to do this because I can really see where it will help my kids, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Steve, so I would like you to talk a little bit about the ethical will and how this death propelled you to do more in your life. And also this beauty of what remains, how that's a part of it. And what do you mean exactly by the beauty of what remains? So I sort of a multi-leveled question.
Well, I'll tell you that the thing about Alzheimer's is it weans you off of the person. You know what Greg was saying about it kind of propelling him more into adulthood. Not that he wasn't an adult before, but a different level of adulthood. And for Marilyn, this all started when he really started to get sick. You know, he was a force in our family, and the disease kind of weaned me off of him. I learned how to live without him. And I'll tell you one moment. This is hard for me to talk about still. Our father was, in a word, frugal. That's an understatement. I mean, he liked to have fun, but only if it was on sale. And I spend money now in a way I did not before he died. And not because I have more, I don't, but because I have less time. I realize I have less time. And I was in, I think a lot of people listening know how much I love Joshua Tree. And I went out there with my son, Aaron, who found a piece of property there. And I was standing there with Aaron on this piece of property. And I just started weeping. And Aaron looked at me and said, "Dad, what's wrong?" And I said, "We're going to buy this and we're going to have a place for our family where we can gather out of the spotlight and just be with each other, and where I can someday be with my future grandchildren." It made me focus more on my family life, and it helped me realize, and I still, as you know, I mean, I work really hard, but it helped me realize that a busy life and a meaningful life are not the same thing. And you really do, it really does end. You know, Kafka said the meaning of life is that it ends. And it's really true. So for me, it's sort of helped me plan ahead. It's helped me think beyond work. It's helped me think about creating a better family life that doesn't involve the same kinds of sacrifices that I've made in the past. So I want to reclaim that. It's kind of the same reason Marilyn moved to Minneapolis. You know, I want it to be real and organic and not something I do for an hour in between my, you know, appointments and things I have and deadlines. So that's a part of it. The beauty of what remains for me is this idea of how death strips away so much, but it leaves what's remaining in greater intensity and relief. And my dad's death did that for me. It made me stop and really savor certain things, certain moments, certain people that I would have rushed by before. And you know, it's so easy to focus on what we've lost. But we've also gained, I don't know about you guys, I'm interested in whether this has been true for you or not, but I feel closer to Dad in death in some ways than I did in life. He's the sharp edges are not there anymore. They're rounded off. They're softer. I now realize the things he taught me that really stick, the Yiddish phrases that were so accurate in describing a person, a situation, a challenge, a moment. He makes me laugh all the time. I haven't dreamed. Have you guys had dreams about Dad? I have not. You guys have. Sherry and Greg, you have?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Marilyn and Joanne and I have not. But he comes to me, you know, not in my sleep, but he comes to me. He makes me laugh. He warns me, you know, not to be, you know, too arrogant and to keep working, and that, you know, the smallest thing could screw it all up. And he's there. He's there in such a big way. And I find it easier to live with than when he had Alzheimer's, personally. So that's sort of the beauty of what remains for me, is the essence of my dad, and a lot of it is the little things. It's not the big things.
Didn't you also mention that it's an impetus to live, take what you received from him, but make it better for
Yeah.
for the next generation, to improve, if you will, on what remains, if you can. Talked about that as well.
Look, I think all of us learn by negative example from our parents in one way or another. We all have parents who are human, and they make mistakes, and they do foolish things, and marriages have sometimes very foolish dynamics. And I think we all learned in some ways. I can only speak for myself. I parent very differently than my father in many ways, and it's quite deliberate. And I'm trying to take the best, the beauty of what remains of him, but also to make it even more beautiful with my own point of view and sensitivity. And I think we've probably all done that. I think we all try to be better versions of our dad. And that's a very noble thing.
So this is my final question before we invite people to ask their own questions. Is you started before we began the program talking about what the book meant to you, how it affected you, what you loved about the book, or how it touched you. So I'd like each of you just to share, you know, what is it about this book that was special for you, reading both the personal story of your father and also Steve's very wise advice and suggestions about how to navigate losing a loved one and the process of grieving and moving on. So I'll go in sibling birth order for this. So Marilyn.
Wow. When I read the book the first time, I laughed because it was so many great memories, that the essence of my dad, of our family. I cried because it's hard still, you know, it's hard. It probably always will be. I thought about how lucky we are, you know, in some ways we got to bury our parents. It's a universal thing everybody in the world does if they're lucky. Children don't die before their parents. We buried our father, and he was elderly, and he'd had a wonderful life, and he knew he was loved, and he was well taken care of. And I think Stephen captured a lot of that in the book. So it was a bittersweet thing, but also I found it very helpful because it had concrete, this is what we do, this is why we do what we do. Do this, don't do that. Just tips. People are afraid of, I think, talking about the nitty gritty of death, and it was helpful to me.
Thank you. Sherry.
Marilyn said just about everything I was thinking of saying, you know, that it brought me joy at some times because it brought things up that I had forgotten about or didn't, you know, or even didn't know, you know, had happened and made me really nostalgic. But the other part of it, you know, it really taught me, you know, because I hadn't thought all that much about death in general and all the processes, and, you know, each chapter had kind of another step, and I am grateful for the learning that I was able to do by reading it.
Joanne?
So we're kind of lucky in our family because we have a rabbi in the family. And so Stephen, you know, a lot of what was in the book was how he brought us through the funeral and the process and all of that. So, you know, in a way it was just very pleasant to, you know, read his take on it. And it was a good reminder of the things that he teaches us all the time as being a family member. So,
Greg?
Of course, everything that my siblings have said, but also, you know, this book is a little bit different than the other books that Stephen has written. You can tell, you know, this was a blow to him. This was, you know, for Steve, this was, you know, really the first big significant loss, you know, in his life. Some of the rest of us have had other challenges or losses or things like that that have impacted us. So I think I saw more of the catharsis of the book specifically for my brother. And that, you know, this is different, you know. Not that Steve's had an easy life or anything like that, and he's worked crazy hard and everything, but this is the thing that would really get him. And so that's kind of what I really liked about the book, is what it maybe did for Stephen.
So what makes this book unique is that half of it is about Steve Leder, Rabbi Steve Leder, the rabbi, teaching us all how to navigate through death. And the other half is Steve Leder, the son, and how it felt as on a personal level to grieve and experience loss. And the combination of two, it's a guidebook, a handbook, and a memoir in a way. And it's a wonderful book. And we want to invite all of you to post about it and let people know about Steve's book. It's a great read. You'll read it a number of times. And I want to thank all of you and Steve, and I want to open this up to questions. And I'm going to look in the chat for, this is from Allison Gingold. Do you feel a responsibility as a sibling of how to ensure each sibling's healing? And also, where do you see the responsibility as a sibling to share experiences as a child together? And how do each of you saw your life, your experiences? So basically, do you feel that you're responsible for each other's healing as siblings? Like you have to take care of each other now. So I'll start with Steve.
Yes, I would do anything I could to help Marilyn, Sherry, Joanne, or Greg heal from any kind of wound. Not just the loss of our father or the eventual loss of our mother. I would do anything to help any of them I would do anything to help to ease their suffering, whatever the source of that pain would be. And do I think that's my obligation? Yes. Is that why I would do it? No, I would do it because I love them. And there are certain aspects of this particular grief that only we can handle for each other and with each other. No one else can do it. You know, it's really just us. And And so I think and there's no one else that personally I feel comfortable really talking about the duality of it all with, the what wasn't so great along with what was, and what wasn't there along with what was there. And so I think, yes, and I know why, Allison, I know why you're asking the question. Allison's husband recently died and she has 4 children. And obviously them caring about and for each other is going to make a big difference. So that's how I feel about it. Can I give anyone a new personality? No. It's what I was saying earlier about, people face death the same way they face life. And I'm not going to give any of my siblings a new personality, and they're not going to give me a new personality. But are we in this together for the rest of our lives? Yes. That's how I see it.
So at this point, if one of the siblings want to say something, why don't you, I'm not going to call on you, you can raise your hand if you'd like to add or comment or not. Does anyone want to say anything about this? Okay. Well, another question that a number of people asked is, do you have any regrets about the things unsaid or any unfinished business? And if you don't have any unfinished business, can you give advice on how people should deal with this? So do you have any unfinished? Okay, Sherry.
I do. This one's going to make me cry. I was through all of the caretaking, all those years. I was never able to, I didn't have the courage to talk about what was happening to my dad while it was happening. I always found something else to talk about. And I was never able to really bring it up with him, tell him I was sorry he was going through it. And I wish I would have, after reading, Stephen, about how helpful that is for people. I really do wish I would have done that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anyone else want to say anything about that? Steve, do you have advice for unfinished
we
business?
each, we're a bunch of high achievers, and failure is a hard thing for all of us. And I feel that I failed in some ways by not going enough. I just didn't go enough. I feel terrible about it to this day. And like Sherry avoided the conversation, I avoided going sometimes because I was so busy, and then there was this and there was that, and I didn't go enough. I feel like I didn't go enough.
So how do you deal with the unfinished business? How do you deal?
Well, I don't think that's the same as unfinished business, because I did have very candid conversations with Dad. I said to him, Dad, I'm so sorry going through this. You were a great dad. You gave me my work ethic, and that has made me who I am. And I did ask him, I said, Dad, when he could still understand and he could nod yes or no, but he couldn't really articulate, I said, Dad, is this the most difficult thing you've ever been through in your life? Because I know that if you can help people understand they've been through something worse before, it helps them get through their current circumstance. And I said, Dad, this isn't the worst you've ever been through, is it? And he shook his head, no. And then I said, was the worst thing you ever went through when your parents stopped talking to you because you and Uncle Mort left the business and started on your own? And he nodded yes, because he had spoken to me about that years before, how much that hurt him. And so I didn't have unfinished business in that sense with my dad.
What do you recommend for people who feel they did?
And the person has died?
Yeah.
This sounds pretty facile, but I would say don't make the mistake with the rest of the people who are still alive in your life. Learn from it. Don't repeat that mistake. And I think talking about it helps. I think Sherry probably feels a little bit lighter now than she did 5 minutes ago. And I think saying it is important, and talking about it is important to the people who know and the people who care. And when it comes to my dad, there's no one who knows better or cares more than these 4 people. So that's the best we can do. is not make that mistake again, and to unburden ourselves with people who care about us and people we love and who we know love us.
So thank you. Can any of you, have you gotten your energy back? That was a question somebody wanted to know. Are you always depleted, or does it come back? And how long did it take? Anyone want to talk about that? Marilyn? Yeah.
For me personally, I thought the first month was
Heavy.
heavy. I was not myself. I knew I wasn't going to be, and as Steve said, I just kind of had to roll through it. And then life happens, and you get busy, and it got a little smoother, little by little. But first month was very hard. But one thing that helped that I wanted to mention was that for so many years when my dad was sick, friends would say, "How's your dad? How's your dad?" And I'd have to tell them this sad story. After he died, so many people I didn't even know, came to me and would say, "Oh, your dad was a great guy. We loved your dad. He used to do this, and he used to come to the bank and hang out with us." And I heard so many wonderful stories that really helped me a lot.
Yeah.
I think for me, the unveiling, that whole process, and then that event of kind of getting together, almost a year later, and seeing that, life had moved on and we'd all moved on, was kind of the end of that kind of grief period for me.
The unveiling, which is a year. Yeah, it's a whole year later.
Well, this is a nuanced point but it's one that I think might help a lot of people who are listening tonight. And that is to be honest about the fact that moving forward requires some measure of betrayal. And this is particularly true with spouses, that in order to move forward and embrace life, you have to willfully let go. And in a way, to say, I can't imagine living without, I'm going to say it. I can't imagine living without Betsy. I can't. But if anything ever happened to her, I would have to betray that feeling to some degree in order to move forward. And that's kind of the dark secret about grief, is about healing. It's also simultaneously a little bit of a betrayal of memory and of a person. And it can create a lot of mixed feelings, and that's just the truth of it. It's, again, one of those dualities of grief, is that in order to move on, you really have to turn your back on some degree to some of the past. Painful.
So
Joanne didn't answer.
Oh, I don't know. I think you guys said it all.
Okay.
This is going to be our last question. Actually, I have a question. This is our second to the last, but the last question that we're going to take is, you're a very unified group. Your family, has come together to deal with the death of your dad. What is your advice to siblings who, this is in the book, I know, about are people going to reconcile? What's your advice to families that are fragmented and can't unite, and how do they navigate losing a parent when they're not united?
The same way they navigated when that parent was alive. It's like Heinrich Heine's quote in the book: "The Jews are like everyone else, just more so." Death just makes everyone more so. And however that dysfunction played out in life, it's going to play out the same way in death. And there's really no fixing it.
You talk about that. My last question is, Steve, you wrote that you came to believe in the eternity of the soul, and perhaps there is an afterlife, but certainly that the soul lives on. And I'd love you to end with that sort of spiritual revelation that you had.
Actually, everyone spoke about it already in a sense, because when you see a dead body, and I guess this sounds odd to put it this way, but fortunately, I had seen 1,000 dead bodies before I had to look at my own father's, right? So it is so obviously not who we are. Our bodies are so clearly only a part of who we are. There's so much more to us than our corporeal being, you know, so much more. In fact, most of my dad wasn't about his body, you know, it was about his spirit. And it still is. And to me, it's just so obviously clear that people live on, people's souls live on in certain ways within us, and within the universe. And I have heard just too many stories to dispute the idea that there is some kind of afterlife. I really do believe in the eternality of the soul. And if you want to be biological about it, we're all the inheritors of DNA from people who came before us. I mean, life does carry on even biologically. But to me, I looked at my dad in that casket, and it just wasn't him. And I think anyone listening tonight who's had that experience understands exactly what we're talking about. But tonight, you know, that's him. Tonight was him. And that body was not. And that's the beauty of what remains. It really, really is beautiful.
Thank you so much, Joanne, Sherry, Greg, Marilyn, Steve, for sharing and opening your hearts and souls to us tonight. We thank you so much for this. The book is going on sale tomorrow. There's a book slide. Here it is. Rabbi Leder's book is almost available. Starts tomorrow, and you're going to love it. It's a really important book. I think you will not regret having this in your library. I've already underlined and circled so many things myself. So I want to wish you all a good evening, and please stay safe and healthy. And one last thing, Steve, how's your mom who had coronavirus?
Mom turned it around. She is tough as nails, and she's doing great. She's doing great. And another example of the 5 of us pulling together, and we spun the job wheel, you know, and we're doing our jobs. You know, Marilyn has got the dishes. I've got the bird cage, and, you know, Greg's got to sweep the garage. We all had a job, and we're approaching it that way with our mom, and it's working out pretty well. And she's, you know, I called her yesterday. Hi, Mom, how are you? I'm fine. Why? I'm fine. What happened? Nothing happened. She's amazing.
Well, thank you all very much, and good night.
Susan, thank you. Sherry, Joanne, Greg, Marilyn, God bless you. Thank you. I love you all. Thank you for doing this. I know it wasn't easy. It means a lot.